Culture Accounts by Serena, Nanda, and Richard L. Worms. Chapter 6, Economics. Ultimate Dictator. The notion that human beings are rational, individual economic actors underlies much of Western economic theory. Economics assume that people are capable of assessing the economic choices facing them, and when they do so, they make decisions that maximize their wealth and minimize their labor. This is certainly some truth to this idea, and all of us can think of cases in which we behave precisely in this way. But economic choices do not occur in a vacuum. Real economic decisions are made in a cultural context and are influenced by ideas about what is right, valuable, and moral, not just about how much we can profit. However, as we have seen in the previous chapters of this book, what is right, valuable, and moral are not the same for everyone. Economists and anthropologists have developed interesting tools to test the degree to which people in different cultures really behave the way that theories say they are supposed to. Two examples are the Dictator game and the Ultimatum game. In the Dictator game, there are two individuals, a proposer and a responder. The proposer is given a sum of money, say the equivalent of 1 day of wages, and is told to split it with the responder. The proposer and the responder are unknown to each other, and they play the game only once, so there is no chance that generosity will be reciprocated. If people try to maximize their wealth and minimize their work, we would expect that the proposer would keep the entire sum, offering nothing to the responder. In fact, that doesn't always happen. In the United States and other wealthy nations, about 30 to 40% of the players take the whole pot. However, most proposers leave between 20 to 30% for the responders. Jean Ensminger found among the Orma, a group of cattle pastoralists living in Kenya, far fewer people, only 9%, took the whole pot, and the others gave an average of 31% to the responders. The ultimatum game is also played with a proposer and a responder. However, in this case, the proposer offers to split a sum of money, and the responder may either accept or reject the split. If a responder accepts the split, the money is divided and the game is over. If the responder rejects the split, neither player receives any money and the game ends. As in the Dictator game, players are anonymous and play only once, so generosity cannot be returned. In the Ultimatum game, respondents who behaved simply as rational maximizers would always accept the proposer's offer because accepting the offer involves no financial cost. An even very low offer is greater than nothing, but real people do not play this way. In the past 15 years, anthropologists and economists have played the ultimatum game with members of many different cultures. The results show that there are no cultures in which everyone is willing to accept whatever is offered. They show a great deal of variation in how much people are willing to offer. Among the Machiguena of the Peruvian Amazon, proposers rarely offered more than 15%, and offers were almost never rejected. American college students, on the other hand, offered 42 to 48% of the pot to their responders, and responders tended to reject offers less than 30%. Some of the results may seem counterintuitive. For example, foraging groups, there is a high degree of equality, but foragers are not generous games players. In Hadza, foragers who lives in Tanzania made some of the lowest proposals any groups tested. On the other hand, industrialized economies are highly stratified and unequal, but their members are likely to offer almost half of the pot to the responders. In fact, the results show an interesting trend. The greater the degree to which the group is involved in market economy, the more likely proposers were to give a larger share of the money to responders. In this chapter, we will explore some of the reasons why this is the case. And the results of the Dictator and Ultimatum games demonstrate the social and cultural dimensions of economic decision-making. In fact, that, cross-culturally, a strong majority of proposers gave responders something may show that all people have a bias toward at least a little generosity. However, The systematic differences among cultures demonstrate that decisions are set in cultural context that determine moral and appropriate behavior, and that these are different in economic systems. Economics is the study of the ways in which choices people make as individuals and as members of societies combine and determine how their societies uses its resources to produce and distribute goods and services. But as our example shows, this process is always set within a cultural context. How can we make these decisions depend on the values we give to both goods and ideas? And that depends upon culture. Every society must have an economic system in the sense that each group of people must produce, distribute, and consume. However, cultural context determines the ways in which goods and services are produced and distributed, as well as meanings of consumption. Economic behavior. Economists assume that because human wants are unlimited and the means for achieving them are not, organizations and individuals must make decisions about the best way to apply their limited means to meet their unlimited desires. As we saw in the opening story, one way of understanding economic decisions is to assume that decision makers will always maximize their financial benefit and minimize their work. Will a business firm cut down or expand its production? Will it purchase a new machine or hire more laborers? Such decisions are assumed to be motivated by the desire to maximize profit. However, the opening story also shows us that this understanding misses critical factors. As human beings, we have only so much time and energy to expend in meeting our desires, but we do not always allocate these to maximize our financial wealth. Consider a choice you may make today. After you finish reading this chapter, you might confront a series of decisions. Should you reread it for better comprehension? Should you study for another course? Call and get pizza delivered? Play with your kids? Socialize with your friends? Hang out online? Will you make your choice based on some calculation of benefit? However, that benefit probably cannot be reduced to financial profit. You may believe that you will make more money if you study and get higher grades. However, your choice is set in a context in which money is unlikely to be the most important element of value. We value our friends, our children, our leisure time, and many other things as well. If you choose to socialize instead of hitting the books, your choice is not irrational, even though it does not necessarily lead to a greater profit. We cannot assume that you will always act to increase your material well-being. Rather, we need to find out what motivates you. Just as you might value an evening spent with friends over in this class, members of other cultures might value family connections, cultural tradition, social prestige, leisure time, or other things over monetary profit. For example, the Hadza mentioned earlier live in an area of Tanzania with an abundance of animal and vegetable food. They have considerable leisure time but make no attempt to use it to increase their wealth. Although they know how to farm, they don't do so. They say it would require too much work. Thus, they value their leisure and socializing they use it for over what they could produce farming. Leisure time is one of the only ends towards which people expend effort. They may also direct their energies towards increasing social status or respect. In Western society, prestige is primarily tied to increased consumption and display of goods and services, but this is not universal. In many societies, prestige is associated with giving goods away. Conspicuous consumers and stingy people become objects of scorn, and they may be shunned or accused of witchcraft. The notion that prestige can be gained through giving is well established in our own society. Universities have buildings bearing names of their most generous donors. Bill Gates is not the only chairman of Microsoft, but with his wife and father, he also co-chairs the foundation with over $39 billion in assets in 2016, and in 2015 gave more than $4.2 billion in grants. To understand the economies of various cultures, anthropologists face two related problems. First, they must analyze the broad institutional and social context within which people make decisions, and second, they must determine and evaluate the factors that motivate individual decision-making. One way we can think about any given economic system is to consider a series of fundamental issues that all societies must face. Because all societies must require food and other materials necessary to their lives, all must engage in production. To do so, all societies must acquire resources, such as land and water, and all must have some system through which the rights to use such resources are allocated. However, resources in and of themselves do nothing. Rather, people must be organized in specific ways to use resources and production of goods and services. Thus, each society has a division of labor, a pattern by which different tasks are given to different members of a society. For example, foragers rely on plants and animals in their environment, but foragers never simply gather and eat plants and animals randomly. In each group, specific groups of people do specific tasks. Most often, men hunt and women gather. Thus, they are organized to produce. In addition, people in all societies exchange and consume products of production. Thus, each society has a system of distribution, and in each there are distinct styles and patterns of consumption. In the remainder of this chapter, we will explore how different societies tackle the problems of allocating resources, organizing labor, and distributing and consuming the results of production. Allocating resources. Productive resources are things that members of a society need to create goods and services and to participate in the economy. How people access this is basic to every culture. The most obvious productive resources are tools, labor, and some economic systems, money. However, knowledge is also critical to productive resource. We can see the effects of access to knowledge in current-day society by looking at the relationship between university degrees and income. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median income for high school graduates in 2015 was about $35,000. The median income for those with bachelor degree was almost $59,000. The median for those with a master's and doctoral degrees was substantially higher. Of course, the university is not only a source of knowledge in our society. An important point of contrast between economic systems is the extent to which members of society have access to productive resources. In general, differential access resources develops as a population and social complexity increase. Most small-scale societies use a relatively small number of productive resources, and most everyone has access to them. Large-scale societies have a great many more resources, but access to them is limited. Again, considering differential access to knowledge in the United States, we see that only 3% of students at the most selective U.S. universities come from households in the lowest 25% income scale, but 72% of students come from the wealthiest 25% of American families. Thus, family wealth plays a critical role in accessing knowledge, and it's a powerful predictor of future wealth and social position. Access to knowledge that allows one to make and use tools plays an important role in all societies. There may be additional important forms of knowledge that can be controlled as well, such as the knowledge of healing or religious rituals. In pre-industrial societies, however, the most basic resources are land and sometimes water. Examining the ways in which people access these particular resources can give us insight into the social organization and other aspects of culture. In foraging societies, naturally occurring abundance and scarcity shape people's relationship to land. Where resources are scarce and large areas are needed to support the population, boundaries usually are not defended. Where resources are more abundant and people move less, groups may be more inclined to fight outsiders who try to use their territory. In most cases, boundaries are flexible so that they can be adjusted as the availability of resources change. Among pastoralists, the most critical resources are livestock and land. Livestock are owned and managed by individual heads of households. Animals, in turn, produce goods that are directly consumed, such as milk and blood. They are also kept as a form of wealth, to produce other animals for exchange for goods and services. Land and water are generally not owned. In many cases, during summer or the rainy season, cattle graze in deserts and highland areas unsuitable for farming. In the winter or dry season, they move to areas that are occupied by settled farmers. Their agreements with landowners and village leaders allow animals to graze on crop waste and the stubble from harvested fields. Most such agreements specify rights, payments, and schedules for all parties. In most societies characterized by horticulture, land is communally owned in an extended kin group. Designated elders or officials of the group allocate rights to use land to individuals or heads of households, but such land may not be sold. Because almost everyone belongs to some land-controlling kin group, few people are deprived of access to this basic resources. Thus, control over land is not a means by which one group can exploit or exert permanent control over another. Horticulture often involves investing a great deal of labor in clearing, cultivating, and maintaining land. The rights to cleared land and its products are vested in those who work it. Because such individuals may die while land is still productive, some system of inheritance of use of rights is usually provided. Among the Lankandan Maya, for example, individuals can farm any unused piece of land. However, clearing virgin land is difficult, so people retain rights to land they have cleared even if it is not currently in production. Maya who migrate may lose their land rights, but their families retain ownership and any fruit trees that they have planted. Should a man die after investing time and labor in clearing and planting land, his wife and children retain rights to use the land. In more politically and technologically complex societies, agriculture dominates production. Enormous amounts of labor are invested in land and very large quantities of food are produced. When this happens, control of the land becomes an important source of wealth and power. Land ownership moves from the kin group to an individual or family. Within the limits of the law or custom, an owner has the right to keep others off the land and to dispose of it as he or she wishes. In agricultural societies, land and other productive resources are often owned by an elite group, and those who own the land usually do not work it themselves. Most fieldwork is done by laborers who often are referred to as peasants. Today, peasants typically pay cash rent to their landlords, but in the past they also provided goods and services, including a small portion of their agricultural production, labor, finished craft goods such as cloth, and raw materials such as lumber. As a result, landowners enjoy relatively high standards of living, but peasants do not. Many current-day societies rely on industrialized agriculture, but in many cases, as we saw in Chapter 5, only a minuscule percentage of the population is directly involved in farming. Therefore, access to productive land is not important for most people in these societies. In industrialized economies, most people earn their livelihood by working for wages for businesses and other organizations that provide goods and services. These usually are organized as capitalist enterprises. We will discuss capitalism at some length later in this chapter. Organizing labor. Resources by themselves are simply physical objects. In order to become useful in a society, people must be organized to use them. Different societies use different patterns of social organization to access and use resources. Households and kin groups in small-scale societies. In many small-scale economies, the household or some extended kin group is the basic unit of economic organization. Rather than working for wages, people labor for their households or kin groups. The labor they perform is an important aspect of their social identity. It situates them with respect to others in their household or kin group and gives them a sense of meaning and identity. The household is an economic unit, a group of people united by kinship or other links who share a residence and organize production, consumption, and distribution of goods among themselves. A household is different from a family because it may include lodgers, servants, and others. A kin group is a group of people who understand themselves to be related either by blood or marriage. Households and kin groups do sometimes seek financial gain, but this is not their primary purpose. Their goals are often social or religious rather than monetary. In economies in which households or kin groups are the units of production, there is often great stability but little economic change. They cannot easily fire members or require new ones. Thus, it is difficult for households and kin groups to respond to the economic opportunities or contract during difficult times. In large-scale industrial and post-industrial societies, work also has very important social implications. Of course, people work to put food on their table and a roof over their head, but as anthropologist Pamela Crespin notes, in the United States, an individual's self-image and social status is bound up with work. Joblessness, or the inability to earn a living wage, diminishes an adult's identity and status. This is an important issue in a nation such as the United States, where in 2011, 1/3 of working families earned less than twice the official poverty rate. Gender also plays an important role in organizing labor. In all human societies, some tasks are considered appropriate for women and others appropriate for men. At some levels, sexual division of labor is biological, because only women can bear and nurse children. However, beyond this, the specific tasks defined as a man's or woman's work vary widely from group to group. For example, in Aztec Mexico, weaving was a female task. Newborn girls were presented with tools for weaving, and weaving equipment was placed with women when they died. However, in most West African societies, weaving is considered men's work. Tight connections between gender and the organization of society are explored at length in Chapter 9. Specialization in complex societies. The division of labor in society becomes more specialized and complex as the population increases and agricultural production intensifies. This is particularly the case in which a society is dependent on grain agriculture. Grains are hard, durable, and storable. People who are able to control them have access to wealth and power in new and important ways. They often become landowners and rulers. Such people are able to use their access to food to support others who are not directly engaged in food production. These are likely to include specialists such as soldiers, government officials, and members of the priesthood. Occupational specialization spreads through society as individuals are increasingly able to exchange their services or the products they produce for food or other forms of wealth. Traditional areas of contemporary India provide an excellent example of occupational specialization. There, only people belonging to a particular hereditary kinship groups can perform certain services or produce certain kinds of goods. Literally thousands of specialized activities, washing clothes, drumming at festivals, presiding over religious ceremonies, making pots, and painting pictures, are performed by specific named hereditary groups. Much of the world's population today lives in industrial or in post-industrial societies, and almost everyone is a specialist of one kind or another. In the United States, the Department of Labor recognizes 840 numbered occupational categories and divides each of these into many subspecialties. Specialization undoubtedly has advantages in the terms of efficiency and the ability to produce large quantities of goods. However, it can take a physical and emotional toll on members of a society. Since the beginning of the industrial age, many factory jobs involved repetitious and mind-numbing labor. Adam Smith, generally considered the founder of modern economics, recognized this. In 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, he wrote that a man whose life is spent in performing simple operations generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Although American automobile workers certainly were not stupid, The automobile plants of early 20th century were examples of extreme mechanization. Workers simply inserted pieces into machines, turned a switch, and waited until the machine completed its task, removed the finished pieces, and passed them on to the next worker. Machinery determined the pace of work and the task performed. In the 1920s, one worker said simply, "The machine is my boss." Factory labor often led to new notions of identity. For example, before the advent of factory labor and assembly lines, many American workers associated masculinity with skilled labor, independence, decision-making power at work. However, on factory assembly lines, labor was boring and monotonous. The workers had little decision-making ability. Companies such as Ford Motors, through public speeches, company policies, and employment practices, sought to redefine masculinity, associating it with working hard in the company of other men on a useful product and being paid well for it, rather than skill and independence. Distribution, systems of exchange and consumption. In all societies, goods and services are exchanged. In fact, some anthropologists have long thought that exchange of goods is one of the fundamental bases of culture. The great French anthropologist Marcel Mauss theorized that societies were held together by patterns of giving and receiving. He pointed out that because gifts invariably must be repaid, we are obliged to each other through exchange. Such obligations help hold societies together. The three main patterns of exchange are reciprocity, redistribution, and the market. Although more than one kind of exchange system exists in most societies, each system is predominantly associated with a certain kind of political and social organization. Let us first look at reciprocity. Reciprocity is the mutual give and take among people of similar status. Three types of reciprocity can be distinguished from one another by degree of social distance between exchanging partners. Generalized reciprocity usually is carried out among close kin and carries a high moral obligation. It involves a distribution of goods in which no overt account can be kept of what is given, and no immediate or specific return is expected. In our culture, the relationship between mother and child is usually a good example. Ideally, such transactions are without any thought of self-interest. Generalized reciprocity involving food is an important social mechanism among foraging peoples. In these societies, hunters distribute meat among members of the kin group or camp. Each person or family gets an equal share or a share dependent on its kinship relationship to the hunter. We might wonder what the hunter gets out of this arrangement. Aren't some people always in the position of providing more than others? Part of the answer is that all people in the society are bound by the same rules. The system provides everyone with the opportunity to give and receive, although this does not necessarily mean that people do so equally. Particularly good hunters also gain satisfaction and a degree of prestige from accomplishing a highly skilled and difficult task. Balanced reciprocity involves a greater social distance than generalized reciprocity and entails a clear obligation to return, within a reasonable time limit, goods of nearly equal value to those given. In the United States, we participate in balanced reciprocity when we give gifts at weddings or birthdays, exchange invitations, or buy a round of drinks for friends. The economic aspect of these exchanges is repressed. We say it is the spirit of the gift that is important. However, we also know that accepting a gift involves the obligation to return the gift of approximately the same value. If we fail to do so, our relationship with the gift giver is unlikely to last very long. Balanced reciprocity is often a characteristic of trading relations among non-industrialized peoples without market economies. Such trade is frequently carried out over long distances and between different tribes or villages. It is often in the hands of trading partners, men or women who have long-standing and personalized relationship with one another. Bronislaw Malowski's analysis of the Kula Ring, an extensive systems of intertribal trade among the inhabitants of the Ring of the Islands off New Guinea, is one of the most famous anthropological studies of reciprocal trading. The Kula trade moves two types of prestige goods, necklaces and bracelets, from island to island around the Kula circle. Solva long necklaces of red shell are always move clockwise direction. Moali, bracelets of white shell, move counterclockwise. Participants receive the necklaces and bracelets from their trading partners. Although kula items can be permanently owned and can be taken out of circulation, people generally hold them for a while, then pass them on. Kula valuables are not simple objects. Each item is known by its history and associations, and some are much more valuable and important and famous than others. The gift or receipt of an important solva or mawali is an action heavily loaded with prestige and politics. Kula exchanges can carry deep emotional importance and involves issues of jealousy, anger, sickness, and witchcraft are sometimes involved. Although the general drama of trading involves a gift or receipt of the kula valuable, mawali are never simply exchanged for salva. A visiting trader hoping to receive an important kula valuable instead brings goods that may include canoes, axe blades, pottery, and pigs, as well as other items. Traders are likely to bring things not found on the island where trading is taking place, because these are likely to be found of greater value to their recipients. The presentation of goods by a visiting trader, as well as declarations of alliance and support, encourages a kula partner to give particularly good muali or solva to the visitor. Such gifts, especially gifts of important or famous valuables, demonstrate and confirm the political importance and allegiances of both the giver and recipient. Critically, the receipt of such gift is also implies the obligation to present gifts of equal or greater importance to the kula partner when he or she comes as a visiting trader. Kula exchanges thus have economic, social, and political functions. They bring kula partners into systems of balanced reciprocity and, in so doing, create alliances that are critical to settling disputes and maintaining peace. This is particularly important because there is no formal government incorporating the different groups that take active roles in the kula. In addition, by moving products to island, kula exchanges increases the islanders' consumption of a wide range of goods, especially those they do not produce, thus raising their standard of living. Negative reciprocity is an unsociable extreme in exchange. It happens when trade is conducted for the purpose of material advantage and is based on the desire to get a better bargain. Negative reciprocity is a characteristic of both impersonal and unfriendly transactions. Tribal and peasant societies often distinguish between the insider, whom is morally wrong to cheat, and the outsider, whom is every advantage may be gained. Anthropologist Clyde Cloghone, who studied the Navajo from the 1940s and the 1950s, reported that their rules for interaction varied with the situation. To deceive when trading with outsiders is a morally accepted practice. Even witchcraft techniques are considered permissible in trading with members of foreign tribes. Negative reciprocity helps explain some of the findings from the Ultimatum Game described in the opening of this chapter. Recall in that the ultimatum, one person splits a quantity of money, offering a portion to another. If the second person accepts the split, they divide the money. If the second person rejects the offer, neither gets any money. Researchers found that the results of the game varied from society to society. In many kin-based societies, the first person is likely to offer only a small percentage of the money and the second person usually accepted it. Whereas in a market-based society, the first person offered a large number of percentages, and the second number was likely to reject small offers. A key aspect in the Ultimatum Game is that the players are anonymous. In kin-based societies, negative reciprocity often characterize anonymous transactions. For players from such societies, offering little or nothing to an anonymous partner is both expected and proper. Because the second player does not expect to receive much from an anonymous person, he or she is likely to accept very small offers. Polly Wisner found that although Juhoan foragers were very stingy game players, in real-life situations in which there is no anonymity, they were far more generous. Using anthropology, gifts, bribes, and social networks. Many classic anthropological studies have focused on gift exchange in relatively small societies without money. However, using gifts to build social networks may serve instrumental purposes, may be a part of large current-day monetized societies as well. When this happens, it raises important questions about the line between a gift and a bribe. Good examples of this come from countries of the former Soviet Union, though they certainly exist in our own society as well. In communist times, having at least some money was relatively common, but goods that could be bought with money were scarce. In this condition, a system called Blatt perverted many aspects of life. Blatt referred to social connections, reinforced by gift-giving that allowed people to gain access to goods, services, and employment, and often admission to universities. A proverb of the era said, "Better 100 friends than 100 rubles." In the post-Soviet Union era, Blatt and other arrangements persist, but they're increasingly complicated. Now goods are widely available in most places in the former Soviet Union, but money to buy them is not. A Bell Police examines gift-giving and corruption in Ukraine in the early 2000s and finds a wide gray area between the two. The Ukrainian government was unable to adequately provide many services to its citizens. Salaries paid to government workers, including doctors and teachers, were inadequate to cover their living expenses. In this context, money and goods received by doctors and teachers from their patients and students were extremely important to their economic survival. However, were these gifts or bribes? From the U.S. perspective, they were bribes and evidence of corruption. From the perspective of the Ukrainian government, receiving gifts of any kind is illegal, but these practices were tolerated to avoid paying higher wages. The perspective of the participants themselves was nuanced. At least in some cases, people giving gifts and payments saw these as signs of gratitude rather than bribes. For many, the sequence of events was important. The payment received before taking an exam or undergoing surgery is a bribe, payment afterwards a gift. The specific actions of the service provider also make a difference. Teachers may allow students to pass exams, and doctors might provide services in expectation of receiving a gift. But they believe that that is different from requiring upfront payment. As one of Polis's informants expressed it, "If I receive it, it is a gift. If I demand it, then it is a bribe." Neither gift givers nor gift receivers understand their actions as simple corruption, but neither do these transactions create an ongoing social ties typical of most gift giving. Such transactions are not exactly gifts and not exactly bribes, and as police propose them as the term brift, halfway between a gift and a bribe to describe them. He argues that brifting is a fundamental aspect of Ukrainian social life, and although brifts in some cases do harm Ukraine's social and economic structures, they are complementary to an economic system that does not guarantee even distribution of welfare. However, as Ukraine's economic situation deteriorated through the first decade and a half of the 21st century, its problems with corruption increased. In 2015, the watchdog group Transparency International ranked Ukraine as 130 of 160 of its corruption index, and by far the most corrupt nation in Europe. Government corruption was a significant cause of the political events that led the Russian military intervention that began in 2014. Redistribution. In redistribution, goods are collected from or contributed by members of a group, then given out to the group in a new pattern. Thus, redistribution involves a social center to which goods are brought and from which they are distributed. Redistribution occurs in many different contexts. In household food sharing, pooled resources are reallocated among family members. In state societies, redistribution can be achieved through taxation. Redistribution can be especially important in small-scale societies where political organization includes big men, self-made leaders who gain power and authority through personal achievement. Such individuals collect goods and food from their supporters. Often these items are redistributed back in communal feast in which the big man sponsors to sustain his political power and raise his prestige. Redistribution also occurred in some chiefdoms. In these cases, however, a distinct hierarchy was involved. Chiefs collected goods and staple foods from many communities to support their household and attendants, as well to finance large public feasts that helped solidify their power. Potlatch feasting among the Native American groups in the Pacific Northwest, including the Kwakwaka, Haida, and Tlingit, are a good example of redistribution. In these groups, potlatches were held to honor and validate the rank of chiefs and other notables, usually in connection with births, deaths, and marriages. A leader holding a potlatch called on his followers to supply food and other goods to be consumed and distributed during the feast, in which he invited group members and rivals. The number of guests present and the amount of goods given away or destroyed revealed the wealth and the prestige of the chief host. At a potlatch, the host publicly traced his line of descent and claimed the right to certain titles and privileges. Each of these claims was accompanied by giving away and sometimes destroying large quantities of foods and goods, such as blankets, carved wooden boxes. As these goods were given or destroyed, the individual and his supporters boasted of their wealth and power. The feasting and gifts given at a potlatch demonstrated the host's right to the titles and the rights he claimed, and created prestige for him and his followers. Guests either acknowledged the host's claims or refused them by staging even larger potlatches. Thus, potlatching involved not only friendship but also competition and rivalry. Between 1884 and 1951, the Canadian government authorities outlawed potlatch, which they believed was wasteful and irrational. Since the 1950s, the potlatch has been revived as a symbol of tribal identity and cooperation rather than a major element in tribal economy. From an economic perspective, feasts such as the potlatch encourage people to produce more than they could otherwise. This increases not only the amount of work they do, but also the amount of food and goods they produce and consume. Because this wealth is often given to people who traveled substantial distances to come to the feast, it was distributed to a fairly large population and ecological area. Although the term potlatch refers specifically to the feasting of the Northwest Coast people, feasting is a widespread phenomenon. In many cases, it plays an important role in establishing social identities, creating political power and equalities, as well as accomplishing work and creating gender identities. We see some elements of competitive feasting in our own society. There may be competition within families or within communities to throw the largest, most elaborate holiday parties, weddings, or coming-of-age celebrations. A couple married in a brief, low-cost wedding and a couple married in a lavish ceremony have the same legal standing, but weddings make different statements about power and prestige. A poll of nearly 1,800 brides who got married in 2011 put the average cost of a wedding in the United States at more than $2,700, an extraordinary amount in a nation where the average family income in that year was slightly over $50,000. However, high-prestige weddings in many cases cost very much more. When Kelsey Clinton married hedge fund manager Mark Mezvinsky in 2010, ABC News estimated the price tag at more than $2 million, with more than $250,000 spent on flowers alone. And the 2004 wedding of Vansha Mittal, daughter of Indian billionaire, cost estimated $60 million. Redistribution may either increase or decrease inequality within a society. A leavening mechanism is a form of redistribution that tends to decrease social inequality. Leveling mechanisms force accumulated resources or capital to be used in ways to ensure that social goals are considered along with economic ones. Leveling mechanisms take many different forms. For example, if generosity rather than the accumulation of wealth is the basis for prestige, those who desire power and prestige will distribute much of their wealth. Sometimes, as with the potlatch, this is accomplished through feasting. However, there are numerous other possibilities. Manning Nash and June Nash described a number of leveling mechanisms that operate the village of Amatengano, the Chiapas district of Mexico. First was the organization of production of households. As mentioned earlier, economic expansion and accumulation of wealth were limited where households rather than business firms are productive units. Second, the system of inheritance ensures that all children share equally in the estate of a parent. Thus, large estates were generally divided at the death of their owners and rarely persist over generations. Third, people who accumulate more wealth than their neighbors or have wealth but are not generous may face accusations of witchcraft, and those believed to be guilty may be killed. Finally, in Amatengano, prosperous community members must hold religious and secular offices called cargos. Cargos are held for a year at a time and require their holders to perform civic duties and to pay for feasts and celebration. Cargos are ranked, and those held by older, wealthier community members are more prestigious and more expensive. Customs are common in northern Mexico and Central America and are referred often as cargo systems. Anthropologists have shown that community obligations such as cargos help limit the economic gap between relatively rich and the poor, though they do not eliminate it. In fact, they may help preserve social hierarchies. Wealthy individuals take expensive cargos that increase their prestige and their recognition, but do not severely impact their total wealth. They remain rich throughout their lives. The poor are generally unable to take cargos and remain poor throughout their lives. Thus, although some wealth is redistributed, the long-run economic differences are reinforced rather than equalized. Market exchange. Market exchange is the principal distribution mechanism in most of the world's societies today. Goods and services are bought and sold at a monetary price determined, at least in theory, by impersonal market forces. Buyers and sellers are usually not connected by the webs of kinship association or in any cases even community residence. The market involves cultural and moral assumptions that are well illustrated by the results of the Ultimatum Game. As we noted earlier, ultimatum players from market economies tended to offer relatively large shares of their money to their partners, and these partners tended to reject low offers. Even though this penalized both players, they played this way because they shared culturally based understanding of the market. For an impersonal market to run smoothly, most participants must believe that they are usually being treated fairly by the people that they do not know. People who take advantage of anonymity to enrich themselves at others' expense spoil the market and must be punished. Thus, ultimatum players from market economies are often willing to reject low offers, taking a loss to show the other player that anonymous partners must bargain and exchange fairly. Of course, the ideal of fair impersonal exchange is that an ideal. Real markets are full of conflicts, inequities, and outright cheats. In our own society, there are clear areas of commerce in which people anticipate a certain amount of deceit. For example, merchants of used goods, particularly cars and machinery, often have reputations for shady practices. The importance of fair play among relatively anonymous actors is illustrated in electronic marketplaces such as eBay or Amazon. In these cases, a sophisticated system of rating gives knowledge about a participant's past transactions. This provides trading partners a degree of certainty that the terms of trade will be fair, but anyone buying online knows that there are fewer or worse ratings of their trading partners, the greater risk they are taking, and the greater potential rewards must be. The phrase, "let the buyer beware," neatly captures the notion that the rules of an even trade are not always enforced. In principle, the primary factors that set prices and wages in a market are related to supply and demand, but individuals participate freely in a market, choosing what they buy and sell. However, the market is almost truly never free. Most markets occur in social and cultural contexts that limit or forbid certain kinds of transactions. As we have seen, people in many societies gain access to land, labor, and some goods through the ties of kinships or obligations of reciprocity and redistribution. In some places, markets, if they exist at all, are limited to a small number of goods. In theory, a society dominated by the market, everything can be bought and sold. In practice, however, all societies limit what can be purchased legally. For example, we live in a market-dominated society, but for moral, social, and political reasons, there are restrictions on the sale of drugs, guns, children, and college degrees. Many other factors interfere with the market in almost all societies. In some cases, wealthy and powerful individuals, organizations, and industries fix prices or wages, forcing people into wage labor or the market at a disadvantageous terms. In other cases, monopolies, secret knowledge, private deals, and hidden connections may distort the market. In yet other cases, cultural ideas about the proper or just price of a good or service are more important than supply and demand. Sometimes governments control or influence of prices commodities such as grains, setting them either high to encourage farmers or low to feed often rebellious city dwellers cheaply. Capitalism. Although some individuals probably act as capitalists, in most monetized economies, societies organized primarily by capitalism are late development in the history of mankind. Capitalist societies were not a natural or inevitable outcome of economic evolution. Rather, they owe their origin to specific conditions of the Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and have become increasingly prevalent in the world in the past 150 years. Capitalism expanded from Northern Europe, North America, and Japan and has transformed economies worldwide, connecting them in a complex, integrated international economy. We described this historic process in Chapter 13, and we examined and analyzed the problems and promises of the global economy in Chapter 14. Here we focus on describing capitalism and pointing out some of its most salient features. In non-capitalist societies, most people produce goods to consume them, to trade them for other goods, or to pay rents and taxes. In capitalist societies, firms produce goods as a means to create wealth. For example, General Motors is not really in the business to make cars. General Motors is in the business to increase wealth of its shareholders. Manufacturing automobiles is one, but not the only one, of the ways it achieves that end. GM is also heavily involved in banking and was historically involved in aviation, military contracting, and the production of consumer products such as refrigerators. Productive resources become capital when they are used with the primary goal of increasing the owner's financial wealth. In capitalism, this becomes the most common use of such resources. Capitalism is further characterized by three fundamental attributes. First, most productive resources are owned by a small portion of the population. Banks, corporations, and wealthy individuals own the vast majority of farms, factories, and businesses of all kinds. Although many Americans invest in business through their ownership of stocks, mutual funds, and retirement plans, ownership of substantial wealth is highly concentrated. For example, in the United States, in 2015, about 55% of U.S. households had money invested in stocks or mutual funds and thus owned some share of a business. However, the median value of all financial assets held by U.S. families in 2013 was only $21,200. According to the G. William Domhoff, the wealthiest 10% of American households held over 90% of all stocks and mutual funds owned in the United States. Thus, although a great many people held some ownership of business, the vast majority was held by comparatively few. The second attribute of capitalism is that most individuals' primary resource is their labor. To survive, people sell their labor for a salary or an hourly wage. The third attribute is that the value of workers' contribution to production is always intended to be greater than the wages they receive. The difference between these two is the profit that accrues to those who own the production resources, generally the shareholders of a corporation. The extremely high wages of some professional athletes and entertainers provide a good illustration of this principle. For example, Cleveland Cavaliers player LeBron James signed a $23 million year contract in 2015. For the team owner, Dan Gilbert, his high salary was easily justified. Gilbert rightly believes that James' presence on the team increases his own wealth. When James returned to the Cavaliers in 2014, their arena revenue jumped more than 40%. Gilbert bought the Cavaliers for $375 million in 2005. In 2016, it was valued at $1.1 billion. James' work accounts for a significant percentage of that increase. James' contract, along with more than $45 million in endorsement deals, makes him a very wealthy man. His net worth is believed to be about $300 million. However, James' wealth plates before that of Gilbert, believed to be about $5.4 billion, placing him at number 286 on Forbes' list of the planet's wealthiest people. We should note here that in a capitalist society, the amount a person is paid has little to do with the value of their labor to a society. Although we may be fans of Mr. James, we do not suffer terribly when he eventually retires. And life continued unchanged for most of us during the 161-day NBA lockout of 2011. However, sanitation workers were to strike or to be locked out. We had no trash pickup for more than 5 months. Almost all of us would be deeply affected, and our lives would be far more difficult. By this measure, sanitation workers are much more socially useful than professional basketball players, but they shouldn't expect to make millions anytime soon. Modern capitalist economies are dominated by market exchange, but this does not mean that people always experience their economy in terms of buying and selling at whatever price the market will bear. Capitalism always occurs within the context of other social relationships, and sometimes these provide a mask behind which it can hide. In other words, capitalist relationships are sometimes camouflaged by family ties or social obligations. When this happens, entrepreneurs may be able to extract extra profits. The production of knitted sweaters in Turkey is a good example of this. Turkey produces many goods and services used in wealthy capitalist nations. Most of the inhabitants of Istanbul, its largest city, are part of a capitalist economy, selling their labor in enterprises aimed at generating a profit. However, as Jenny B. White reports, many of them, particularly women, understand their work in terms of reciprocity and Kim obligations rather than capitalism in the marketplace. Turkey is a patrilineal and patriarchal society. Turkish women live in a complex social networks characterized by social obligations and relations of reciprocity. To a great degree, they measure their worth by the work they do for family members. Being a good woman means laboring for family and relatives. Married women live with their husbands' families and are expected to manage the households and to keep their hands busy with knitting and other skilled tasks. Such tasks are not considered work, but are rather considered a necessary obligation of married life. In the neighborhood White investigated, almost everyone believed that a woman should not work for money, yet about 2/3 of women earned money by knitting garments that were sold in wealthy nations. How was this contradiction explained? The women who do it see their production as a way for them to keep their hands busy, and thus part of their duty as wives rather than a form as paid labor. Their work forms a part of their obligation to their husband's family and to organizers who are often relatives, neighbors, and friends. They consider their work a gift of labor and understand the payments they receive to be gifts from someone with whom they have established a social relationship. Because the women's work is set in a context of global capitalism, through work organizers may be relatives and friends, they are also capitalist entrepreneurs hoping to make money. Since the women produce goods for the capitalist marketplace, Their wages should be set by that market. However, the capitalist aspect of their work is masked by social relations they have with the labor organizer. Because they understood their work in terms of social obligation, they rarely think about how much they're earning per hour and how they might use their time and talents to make more money. Thus, they are willing to accept far lower wages than otherwise might be the case. In some ways, the system serves the women well. They are able to fill their roles as wives and in-laws, and their social connections with labor organizers may give them some degree of security from the ravages of the marketplace. This is important in a country such as Turkey, where most people have little money and social services are few. However, it is clear that the greatest beneficiaries of this system are the firms and consumers in wealthy nations. In fact, that social relations mask capitalism for poor women in Turkey allows rich consumers to buy hand-knitted sweaters at very low prices, and the firms that sell the sweaters to make windfall profits. It would be difficult to find any people in the world today not affected by capitalist markets. For the most part, members of traditional societies enter the market as low-wage workers. The wealth they produce accrues to elites within poor nations as well as to owners and consumers in wealthy nations. The case of the Turkish women illustrates some of the ways in which this process takes place. Not all societies are able to make such accommodations, however. In the expansion of capitalism, and political power has been accompanied by a wide-scale destruction of traditional societies. Chapter 13 examines this process in some detail. Resistance to capitalism. Capitalism is a powerful economic system. It undoubtedly provides a greater number of goods and services to larger populations than do other ways of organizing an economy, but at a cost. When some individuals or groups own or control basic resources, others must inevitably be denied access to them. This results in permanently differentiated economic and social classes. Capitalism dictates that there will always be rich and poor. Often, part of the population lives in extreme poverty without access to basic resources. In American society, this includes the homeless, the landless rural poor, and the permanently unemployed. Although the capitalist economy has expanded in every part of the world, there are probably no countries where all of the population is directly involved in it. Non-capitalist groups, often indigenous people, remain. These people are often pushed to areas such as the jungles of Brazil or the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where the terrain or climate to make agriculture unprofitable and military control extensive and difficult. However, mass-produced goods, media, and fashions from capitalist societies are easily found, even in these locations. In other places, issues of race, gender, and ethnicity prevent people from fully participating in the capitalist economy. Despite the international success of capitalism, it has, from its origins, encountered frequent and sometimes violent resistance. In the early 19th century, Luddites smashed the weaving machines of the early capitalists in an attempt to preserve skilled labor in cottage industries. By the late 19th and early 20th century, radical unions such as the Industrial Workers of the World campaigned for the abolition of capitalism and wage labor. In the 1960s, anti-capitalist protests broke out across Europe, Japan, and the United States. Protests in France in 1968 were particularly widespread, with workers joining student protesters and bringing the nation to the brink of revolution. Protests continued in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s with riots and mass arrests accompanying meetings of major capitalist institutions such as the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, protests broke out again in many places. The best known of these was the Occupy movement of 2011, which began in New York, but rapidly became global with rallies held in more than 900 cities throughout the world. Although the support of the movement eventually diminished, resistance to the current distribution of wealth continues. In 2015, a Gallup poll reported that 63% of Americans believe that wealth should be distributed more evenly. In addition to taking to the street to protest, people resist capitalism in other more subtle ways. The fundamental social arrangement of capitalism is that most people sell their labor for wages to capitalists who reinvest profits to create greater wealth. However, many people in the United States and throughout the world neither work for wages nor hire workers to make investments to increase their wealth. In the United States, they often get by using a combination of techniques that include subsistence gardening, garage sales, and trading their labor with others. They work for others only when they absolutely must, taking part-time jobs or leaving full-time employment as soon as they have enough cash for an immediate need. And this is not only an American phenomenon. Wilson found that people who drove horse carriages in Ireland were often fleeting wage labor. Other members of their societies worked in factories and had previous experience of wage labor themselves, but had given it up. One said that even if they paid him twice as much to work in a factory, he'd rather drive a carriage. In the United States, individuals are often proud of their ability to support themselves outside of the boundaries of wage labor. However, the fact that they resist principal elements of capitalism in doing so reminds us that economic systems are not natural and inevitable. The ways in which we organize our economy are the result of history, politics, economics, and individual choices, a creation of culture, not natural law.